Okay, welcome to this May community call. We've got an exciting agenda ahead for you. Let me just share my screen here a moment. This is our agenda. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about a new capability that we launched yesterday called Dapr Workflows. And then we will have Johnny dive into MDNS, or the multicast domain name system, and some of the capabilities that involve working particularly with cross-container calls and working with Compose. Yaron will give a little recap of what happened at Build, and then we will have a chance to ask plenty of questions for Q&A. So with that, let's just get started a little bit on Dapr Workflows. I'll give a little intro and then I'll hand it over to Yaron. What we did effectively over the last few months is we work closely with the Logic Apps team, which provides workflow capabilities for applications. And we've recognized over time that there's a lot of need for building workflows into applications, particularly line of business applications. And so we set about, as we've done with other frameworks that build on top of Dapr, like ASP.NET Core, like Spring Boot, like with the Active framework as well that exists inside the SDKs for the .NET and Java, and also the Python one that we showed last week. These are all more productive developer frameworks for helping you build applications. So we looked at Logic Apps. They had done work recently to host Logic Apps in their own outside of Logic Apps as a service, and so we thought it would be great to integrate with. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Yaron and let him take it away and dive into some more details.
Thanks, Mark. Let me just share my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about cloud native workflows and how we do it with Dapr and Logic Apps. So what we announced yesterday was a host that allows you to run Logic Apps outside of Azure with Dapr and invoke workflows using Dapr. And like Mark mentioned, workflows are really common in many scenarios today. Also, to orchestrate some pieces of code which you might not want to do as a developer who wants to focus on their business logic. So for example, orchestrating calls between different services, or saving stuff to the database, or doing pub/sub, or invoking external systems. Most of that stuff can actually reduce the amount of code you need to write if you can encapsulate it in a workflow. And because Dapr is in the business of making things easier, we thought about how we can provide workflows with Dapr. So let's talk about this from a scenario perspective. Let's give an example of a developer that needs to write an application that, for example, invokes an HTTP endpoint, which can really be any HTTP endpoint, saves the result back into a database, and then only if the save operation is successful, it sends the requests back, or the result actually, to an external system for further processing, and that external system can be one of many. And the code needs to be, of course, easily portable to on-premises or different clouds. So we wouldn't want to hard code to any particular environment. And as a developer, I also want to provide visibility into my call flow and my application stack. So whenever a workflow gets invoked, I really wanted to tie into all of the application distributed tracing map that I get for the other calls that I have in my system. So distributed tracing. Now without Dapr, if I were to do this, I'd need to pull in different SDKs into my code. I would need to learn and form domain-specific knowledge about each of those SDKs. I would need to write code for fault handling and resiliency, for example, for getting the HTTP response, saving it to the database, sending it to the external system. I would need to write the code for the tracing and metrics. And then for every cloud environment or environment in general that I would need to deploy this to, I would need to repeat those steps above and target different SDKs. And then I need to build the code, deploy it, and there's a sad face in there, and maintain the code in the long run. And now Dapr makes it easier because with Dapr, you basically write code for the Dapr APIs, and then the different components that actually get used can be composed using different YAMLs and then deployed to the different environments. And we still need to build the code, deploy the code, and maintain, albeit less code. But with Dapr and Logic Apps, or Dapr and workflows really, we can still define the component YAMLs for the different environments, and then the bulk of our logic can actually go inside the workflow, and the orchestration code is essentially gone. Now, personally, I don't believe in complete no code scenarios, but once you can encapsulate the core or spine of your app into a workflow type thing, you can actually focus more on the business logic and really get rid of a whole lot of boilerplate code. So let's see how this is done. What we did was basically create a separate process that communicates with Dapr. So that separate process is just a regular application that gets deployed next to Dapr, and this is thanks to the Sidecar architecture that Dapr employs. So a user would invoke a workflow using the Dapr endpoints, which you know today, so HTTP and gRPC, or through different events coming in from Dapr bindings. And then the Dapr sidecar would invoke that Dapr workflow process on the right, which hosts the Logic Apps runtime and loads all the workflows. So that's how you can invoke the workflows in really any environment, and anywhere Dapr can run, this can run. So we're going to take a look at a no-code example, and over here to the left we have this disturbingly looking happy user here. And they invoke Dapr using an HTTP call to start a workflow, and then Dapr is going to reach to that Dapr workflows engine, and we will basically be looking at a workflow that invokes an HTTP endpoint, saves the result to a database, and then if all those are successful, it will send the result to an external system and then return the result back to the original caller. And so in the example we're going to see today, the HTTP endpoint is going to be an Azure function. The database is going to be Redis, and then the binding is going to be AWS SQS, and I'm going to show a really simple consumer here running on an EC2 instance in AWS consuming that binding. So let's head over to the code. And what I'm looking at now is actually the workflow that encapsulates all that. So instead of writing code that talks to an HTTP endpoint and then saves the result into a database and then talks to Dapr to send it to a binding, I can really encapsulate all that in a pretty simple 82 line of code JSON file. And so this really shows how you can compose pretty powerful workflows. And we're going to see that in action in just a few seconds, because Dapr runs next to the workflow engine. And that means that the workflow engine itself can call back into Dapr. And so you can use the Dapr APIs as part of your orchestration. So here we have a function action, which is an HTTP type, which basically invokes the Azure function. And then we have a save state operation, which runs after the function step was made. And here we have the body, and this is the body that goes into the Dapr state API, which, this is the Dapr URL here. So we have a key, and we're saving the state with my key and the value. Logic Apps specifically has really powerful data composition transformations, which you can do. For simplicity, I'm just saving the value as is, but you can add multiple steps here. And also, enrich data. And then finally, once it's succeeded, we're sending it to any binding. And what's really powerful about this is that this entire workflow is portable, because this is abstracted. This is a state store. It's a Dapr state store. So on any environment, this can be targeted to, anything. So, on Azure, it can be Cosmos DB. Google Cloud, it can be Cloud Firestore, and my local machine can be Redis. And then the binding, also, it can be Event Hubs, SQS, or any of the, 18 or 19 supported Dapr bindings today. And then you can also insert other really powerful functionality. So for example, if you have other services in your cluster, you can use the Dapr service invocation building block to take the result and orchestrate a workflow where you send it to each service, get the response back, and then create this pipeline where the request goes into each and every part of your application. And you can also do pub subs. So for example, for here, you'd call publish. And this flow really shows how we invoke an HTTP binding, save the state, and then send it off to a binding. And then finally, we input the response back. It runs after the send to binding. Action has been successful. And so this will run to completion if all the other steps run to completion. Now, I created this JSON manually. I've been told I'm a masochist by doing it because apparently Logic Apps has this really awesome designer in Visual Studio, which you can use. So it's like a wizard GUI thing where you can actually create those workflows. I actually thought that after reading the initial guide, it was pretty easy for me to author this JSON by hand, but you can do it however you want to. So this is quite powerful indeed. You can take advantage of the existing UIs and just use them with Dapr. And so let's get this up and running. So I'm going to run this thing locally, and then I'll briefly show how you can run this on Kubernetes. So I basically just have this repository cloned, and I'm going to use Dapr run. And what this is going to do is it's going to start a Dapr application. So it's going to launch Dapr runtime with an ID of workflows. It's just setting the ports here, and I'm running .NET run. So this will basically start the Dapr workflows process. And the Dapr workflows process receives parameters saying where the path for the workflows path is. So this is going to point to the directory that's holding this JSON file here. Plus another sample JSON that we have. And we also have a few bindings here. So for example, state store is going to be created with the Dapr CLI for Redis. And I also have a binding here for my binding because I'm going to send it to SQS. And if we take a look at that, it's inside this component folder here. And we can see that we have the component YAMLs here. So this is the my binding, bindings AWS SQS. And I can close this and run. And this will basically launch Dapr, and we should see the Logic Apps host spinning up. So if we'll take a look at the logs, we can see that it started real quick. It loaded all the workflows, and we're up and running. So I'm just going to go over here to my terminal, and here I'm on my AWS instance. And I have the same SQS YAML here, and I'm just going to launch Dapr on this EC2 instance. So Dapr is up and running here. And this really simple Dapr app is just listening to events from AWS SQS. And then the last thing I need to do is just to invoke the workflow. So I'll go here and open a different terminal, and I can just curl Dapr. It's really as simple as that. So I'm basically calling the service invocation workflow, and the workflow name gets automatically registered in Dapr as the method that you can invoke. So I could invoke it with a binding if the binding name is equivalent to the workflow, or I can just call the service invocation, telling Dapr, hey, invoke the workflows host with workflow number 2. So let's kick this off. And we see that it ran to completion, and that's basically it. So if we go back here, we can see that indeed our application got the message. And let me just close this here. And if I go back, actually I didn't want to close it prematurely. Let me launch it again, because I want to show you the state. So, and if I also curl, I can curl Dapr and view the state. So in the workflow itself, I saved the state with the key of my state. And we can see that we have the state. And so this entire workflow ran to completion. You might be wondering where the state of the workflow is saved. So each step is basically saved in Azure Blob Storage account. So today you basically need to provide your Azure Blob Storage account. Of course, this can run anywhere. Azure Blob Storage is where Logic Apps keeps the state about where each step of the workflow, where it got to and where it was executed and where to continue off, basically, if it crashes in the middle. So there are a few interesting things in the roadmap. And if we go back here, what does the future hold? So first of all, we're going to replace Azure Blob Storage with Dapr, so that you can actually save the state of the workflow itself with Dapr, because Dapr provides state, right? So there will be no need to provide an Azure Blob Storage account. So while today you can actually run this outside of Azure, which is awesome by itself, You can run it in any cloud or on-prem environment. It would be also really cool to take advantage of Dapr and not have to give in your Azure Blob Storage account. And then also native support for Dapr actions in a workflow. So if we go back here and we look at the workflow itself, you can see that we're using the Logic Apps HTTP actions to basically reach into Dapr. But for example, if we have a type, imagine you have a type that's called a Dapr, right? And then the inputs can be something like method save, and then it'll encapsulate the save state operation for you, or the service invocation. So really turn Dapr into native types inside of Logic Apps. And then also, there is no reason why Logic Apps will be the only workflow engine integration that we have. Because we didn't make any changes in Dapr to support this, the host itself that runs the Logic Apps engine is totally decoupled. It communicates with Dapr over the Dapr APIs, but there was no work that we needed to make inside of Dapr to make this work with Logic Apps. And so, for example, you can think about things like an AWS workflow step functions workflow engine, or workflow engine that encapsulates a CNCF spec for workflows, which is being talked about, or any other type of open source workflow engine or a managed service. And then you can insert your idea here. We'd love to hear from you, the community, about where to take this. We've seen some pretty good comments on this on social, and there's excitement about this, and we're excited to keep working with you on this. So I'll open it up for questions now. Thank you. Dr. Sharon.
There's one question here that goes, can we use workflows with actors and manage multiple invocations of the actor where each step may require input to determine the path through the workflow?
Yeah, so that's definitely doable. Because Dapr actors are invoked over HTTP, the answer is yes, you can indeed orchestrate workflows with calling to specific actors. And Logic Apps also has a for each type of expression that you can put inside of the workflow itself. I imagine most workflows will have that. So you can actually get to some pretty interesting complex workflows with actors. It's a pretty good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I think another thing that was on the roadmap was the managed connectors that exist inside Azure for workflow.
Yeah. So Logic Apps today doesn't allow you to run managed connectors from Azure outside of Azure. Once they have that supported, it will be transparently supported in Dapr too.
So we're pretty excited by this. We think that there's a lot of workflow type applications out there. We've seen quite a few already. Hopefully, we would love to see what you do with this. We're pretty excited given that we've launched this. And we're going to see more integrations like this coming with other frameworks. So if there are other frameworks you think are interesting that we can integrate with, things like maybe Django in the Python space or other ones like this, please shout out and talk about what you think is interesting, as well as other type of workflow engines. Any more questions before we move on?
Hey, Mark, it's Monty.
Yes.
Hey, just real quick, I'm trying to wrap my head around, what Yaron just showed. This is outside of the service, of the Logic App service, right? So we're really kind of running the SDK. We can run it anywhere.
Yes, in fact, I mean, maybe we should emphasize this at the beginning. So up until now, up until build of this year, Logic Apps has only been available as a service inside Azure. And Logic Apps built a workflow engine that that gets hosted inside that. So there's a general move afoot across many of the services inside Azure to make them move to become on-premise. You may have seen there was an announcement a couple of weeks ago where API management also moved so they can host API-M inside a container. So Logic Apps can now be hosted as the NuGet libraries and hosted and run them inside any environment of your choice. And so they've just published those NuGet libraries. And so we said, great. How are you going to run this thing? And they were like, well, we're just a bunch of NuGet libraries. So we said, well, let's integrate this into a host, put that inside a host process, and now you can run that inside as an executable if you want, or you can just run it inside a container process. And so that's exactly what we've done. So now, yes, you can run Logic Apps inside other environments, such as Kubernetes cluster or IoT Edge or anything else of your choice.
Yeah, and actually I didn't show this, but if you go to our repository, there is an end-to-end example there of how you can containerize this thing and run it on Kubernetes or actually any orchestrator of your choice.
Excellent. And just to confirm, you guys had shown Azure Functions previously, and that's kind of the same thing, right?
Yes, in fact, you wait for another announcement in a couple of weeks' time, where, in fact, probably at our next community call, we're going to be talking about a similar thing that we've done, an integration that we've also done with Azure Functions. So,
Right.
you know,
And durable functions, you know, as well, right?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, durable functions has a way that they persist their state. The way you think about durable functions in many ways is it's a bit like a workflow. So durable functions is more like a workflow thing itself, rather than you know, because it coordinates a set of processes. So the workflow and the logic apps team are working closely together to try to bring together those two technologies so that durable functions and workflows end up with sort of one workflow engine.
Oh, that makes sense.
Because it's really,
the more common, the better.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
I think actually, if you go back to some of the build talks, you know, the move generally is to have logic apps, durable workflows, and functions, you know, so that you can run them together inside a host process that you can run inside there and have that host inside a service. Independent of all of that, you know, we're looking about how functions itself and logic apps can run outside of the managed services and put them inside your on-premise clusters or other hosting environments with Dapr.
I love it. It's a beautiful thing, guys.
Yes.
It fills this huge gap, as you guys are talking about.
It fills a huge gap. And going back to the designer, by the way, you know, although Yaron showed you the core workflow, yes, JSON file there. There's actually, I think there's two plugins now for logic apps for the VS Code extension. One that's a graphical designer, another one that's just a schema editor. So I think they've taken the workflow designer that you find inside the portal, inside the service, and you can go in there and that will just output a workflow for you, and you just take that. So easy way now to create a workflow, go to Azure portal and do it there. However, they've also taken that workflow designer and hosted it inside VS Code now, so that you can just do inside VS Code, drag and drop, and then it will output the workflow for you.
Ding, that's beautiful stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, I looked at that slide that Yaron had, and I've lived through that many times. So I really don't want to do all those plumbing again. So it's beautiful.
Yes, yeah. This saves you a lot of plumbing, and if you need a workflow engine to do, you know, call service A, you know, do X, do Y, and you need it all to be recoverable, so that when you have failover conditions, you want to restart from where you left off and not rerun the whole application again. That's what workflow will do for you.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback, Monty, and everyone in the chat.
Yes. Oh, there's another question. I like the idea and shows the power capability of using HTTP for everything. Yes. Any more questions? But if there are, we'd always have a chance to ask them at the end. Let's move on now. And Johnny, share your screen, please.
Cool. Give me a second. You see that? You see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Is the font size all right?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so my update's not quite as exciting, and it should be pretty short. So basically, as most of you probably know, when you're running Dapr in standalone mode, service invocation and service discovery works over, by default, a mechanism called MDNS, or multicast DNS. It's not, the current implementation is tied to that. There's been some discussions, like this could be extended to support other methods of service discovery, but that's kind of what's implemented at the moment. The initial implementation of this assumed basically localhost. So when you were running in standalone mode, it assumed that all your services were running on localhost. So service A boots up with its sidecar and it registers itself under its Dapr ID. And then service B boots up and registers itself under its Dapr ID, and they both assume they're on the same host. So the service discovery was only actually discovering ports rather than host names and ports. So I made a change basically to introduce that to do host names as well. And the reason I did that was so that I could actually run Docker Compose with Docker. With Dapr. You could do this kind of previously using network, like host networking with Dapr Compose, but that only works on actual Linux daemons. It doesn't work on Docker for Windows or on Mac. So this actually brings native support to Docker networks, but it also allows Dapr to run across multiple machines as long as they have, they can talk over the multicast domain. So as long as your machines in whatever configuration you have share the multicast domain, then you should be able to run Docker Dapr instances across those in Docker and have the service invocation work, or out of Docker even. So I put together a quick sample using Docker Compose to express this. So this is a basic Docker Compose definition, and basically just calling out the key features here. This is running exactly the same sample apps as the Hello World sample that you're probably all familiar with. So it's the #1 sample in Hello World to get started with Dapr. Again, you've got the Python app, you've got Sidecar, you've got the Node app, and you've got Sidecar, and you're calling from the Python app into the Node app via Dapr service invocation. But previously, this would only work on a single host, and now you can do that across multiple hosts. And Docker networks include that, as each host will get a unique IP on the Docker network. So as you can see here, we've got the Node app, and I'm putting that on this Hello Dapr network, and I'm exposing the gRPC port because that's going to be what the service invocation happens over. And then I have this Sidecar image defined here, so the Node app Dapr service. And the magic source really is this network mode here, where I can basically say, I want this container to effectively share a network namespace with this service here. And that means that the local host interface, which Dapr talks to with its Sidecar, is preserved, and that then still works. And then basically you have to mount in any components into the service as well, so that Dapr can use those components. And you are also now talking between services rather than localhost to your placement service and localhost to Redis and things like that. You're now going to use Docker service names because they will resolve to the Docker IP at runtime. So if we were to look at, say, the state store, you'll see that rather than like localhost, we're using the Redis name here, and that maps to the Redis service name here, and that will resolve to the IP of the Docker container when it's running. So that's basically it. You've got this definition of the Node app and its Sidecar, the Python app and its Sidecar. Again, same pattern here. And then you can go ahead and run this just using make run. This is effectively just using Docker Compose up, so there's no magic source behind that. It just changes the image to my image. And then this goes and works across the different networks. So if I was just to spin up here, we could come in, let's just do Nocode PS, and see the different containers running. So now if you're running like just a local app, which contains multiple different services that you want to run, and you want to run it easily, you can now capture that in a Docker Compose definition and basically orchestrate it all together, rather than having to run all these different terminals trying to orchestrate it. And they're all running on the Docker network here. So this Hello Compose Docker network. So each one of those apps will have a unique IP on that, and then they'll be able to talk over it. So there's not much more else than that. I think the implications of it are relatively big. I mean, they'll allow you to run this across multiple machines as well. So if you wanted to run different Dapr hosts on different machines, that could work. So I'd be interested to see what use cases people have and what people think of it. So we can just tear that down, and that's it from me.
Well, fantastic. I think it's pretty exciting, actually. I think a couple of people have asked before, how can they run Docker Compose? So now you can use Docker Compose, yes?
Yep.
Yeah, and this is also really great for running Dapr in IoT edge deployments, which is something that we're looking at, and we hear customers wanting to run Dapr there. So this really unblocks those type of scenarios, which is awesome. So thank you, Johnny.
Yeah, the multi-machine capabilities, yes. So I have 2 machines inside my network.
Yeah, as long as they're sharing the multicast domain, then yeah, they should be able to talk.
So that sample that you showed, is it available somewhere?
Yeah, so this samples are currently a PR into the samples repo. So there might be a bit of feedback on that and stuff before it gets merged, but the actual changes are merged into the components contrib repo and the Dapr repo, so they should be coming available in 0.8.
All right, fantastic. Any questions on that, what Johnny just showed? I mean, it's pretty good stuff actually, because now, you know, it's been the ability to use Docker Compose, the ability to do service identification across multi-machine. You know, when we showed before in our 2 weeks ago, we showed how you put Dapr on your own, showed how you just run it on VMs. So if you do Dapr on a set of VMs now, it'll work across more than a single instance machine. And of course, if we put it onto multiple edge devices as well, it's another place it will work. So
yes, so machine-to-machine service invocation outside of Kubernetes. Yes.
Exactly, outside of
Very
Kubernetes.
awesome.
All right, fantastic. Well, if you have any questions, we have a chance to ask them at the end. Let's just move on now and do a little recap from what happened at Build. And Aaron, I'll give you a chance to share your screen.
Awesome. So while I'm sharing this, cool. All right. So yeah, last week was Microsoft Build. It was a new format versus what we have done in the past, where everything was online, delivered digitally, with like a 48-hour telethon of different sessions. And we were able to take Dapr and present it during that 48-hour block 3 different times for the 3 different time zones. It was a bit of a whirlwind, actually. Mark and I were up at 2 a.m. on Wednesday, and then we later presented at 3:45 p.m. Pacific time on Wednesday, and then up again 6:30 a.m. Thursday. So we actually put together a link for you to go check out those recordings. We recommend the 3:45 one. That was the where we got it just right with the really good questions and great audience. For all the different time zones, we actually got people from all over the world. We saw people coming in from Italy, France, the UK, Russia, like some of the Southeastern Asian countries, the US. It was really cool seeing like the global presence of Dapr and getting a lot of engagement from developers from across the world. So yeah, if you could go to this link, aka.ms/Dapr-build2020. We actually created a new repository for events like this, with Build being our first entry. The idea is that separate from samples, we're going to be including a lot of the main demos that we do as part of events, whether that's Build or any future conferences coming up, or perhaps even some of the bigger demos that we do as part of the community calls. The idea is that these are like point-in-time demos. Like, we won't be updating these necessarily if there happens to be a breaking change in further updates of Dapr, but we do welcome contributions if you do notice a breaking change. So for this particular one, the Twitter sentiment processor, which we demoed as part of this session, you can go in there and see the recorded session itself. You can go and see actually the raw recordings of the demos, and we'll tell you like which version of Dapr this was built on. And we have like a full walkthrough of the entire demo, the pipeline that we used, all the different components, how to set it up step by step. And we even included further steps that we didn't get into during the session. So you can go and run this on Kubernetes as well. So we highly recommend going and checking this out. And if there are some cool demos that you've done as part of this community call, you can do a PR into that as well. We welcome all sorts of demos. But yeah, we had a really good time, lots of engagement. We're still waiting to get some of the raw numbers for how many people had viewed that session, but like we struggled to get through all the questions that we had in the 10-minute Q&A at the end. So if there's anyone on the community call today who joined us and found out about Dapr or learned more through the session, welcome. We're so happy to have you as part of the community, and we're looking forward to helping you build your applications on Dapr.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Also, Mark, I was about to say, Mark also did a little section inside his talk, Mark Rosanovich, yes? Which is worth checking that one out as well.
Yes, yep. There's a Build live session with Mark Rosanovich, and he goes into a little bit of background of Dapr and the Azure Incubations team. And yeah, also a great session to check out. And also shout out to Mark Schwarmy for building the demo. He did a wonderful job. He was been on the team for a couple of weeks, and we got to show his code as part of the session. So shout out to him.
Great.
So by the way, one more note. I noticed the Microsoft developer channel on YouTube uploaded all the all the build related sessions. So I'll later on go to our YouTube page and make sure that we link to those. So there's a nice playlist for all the Dapr mentions. That would be maybe another way to discover these.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, hopefully people have a chance to see any of the other build talks and hopefully get some fun with that. So with that, we have about 20 minutes for people to ask any questions. As always, it's an open question time. You can ask questions about literally anything, whether you want to ask about timeline, whether you want to ask about particular feature capability that's happening, an API, some issue you're having. No question will be turned away. So we'll open that up. I can talk a little bit if you want me to about what we're doing with the 0.8 milestone, but I'll let people open. Yeah, I either put it in the chat window or turn your mic on and just ask free form, over the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, I had a question real quick. I guess there's a conversation happening in the components contrib and in the core repository about potentially integrating OPA as a sort of policy provider. I wanted to see the team's thoughts on that.
Yes, so I mean, we actually haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that. So I do think it's a good idea, but we haven't actually spent a lot of time thinking on that. Yaron, is there anything you want to comment on that?
On OPA, we talked about this, I think, a little bit in the past. We are looking into it. We saw that the issue that was opened on the Dapr repo got traction. It seems interesting because as time goes by, we are seeing that we're writing sort of policy-like things for Dapr, yes. And eventually, instead of coming up with our own way to do that, it will be beneficial to just take advantage of stuff that's already out there, because we want to integrate with things as much as we can and not reinvent the wheel. Yes. And so Open Policy Agent really makes sense. That being said, we are focused on the 1.0 release. So there may be some time before you see this, unless someone wants to pick it up and help us walk through a design, or even issue a PR for it. That would be most welcome even. But generally, if anyone here in the community call wants to get started with contributing to Dapr, the first thing you'd want to do is basically find an issue, preferably those with good first issue labels on them on any of the Dapr repositories. Specifically for Open Policy Agent, we have an issue for it. So if you think you can work on a design and basically just list it out there, that's the way to get started. Once we sign off on the design, then we can start, either work on it ourselves or guide any contributor who wants to do the work themselves to do it. Yeah, that's the way to go about it.
I will reflect that, on Open Policy Agent, great piece of technology, and certainly we will go down that path. But for the 1.0 release, which we're trying to get to, it probably may not get into that unless someone contributes it. We don't have any plans to put that in just yet in terms of the team that people that we are focused on that. But that doesn't mean to say it can't be done.
I'll just quickly say that I've got some WIP around Open Policy Agent HTTP middleware. So this is for like using OPA to basically do policy on incoming HTTP requests. I think you can apply OPA to Dapr in a few different ways. So you could look at different parts of Dapr under OPA. But if I find that that's like actually plausible and I think it's got legs, I've got something basic working at the moment, then I'll put a proposal together, Yaron, and then we can go from there.
That would be awesome.
That'd be awesome, yeah.
Cool. Yep, and yeah, if that gets legs and that looks good, I'd be happy to help contribute to that too, because that would help take a lot of work that we're sort of doing in my team with Dapr authentication and make that much simpler to integrate.
Okay, that's great. Then we'd love to hear more about your scenario.
We'd love to, yes.
Maybe not now, but I mean, reach out to us. We should be pretty easy to find. Yeah, and we'd love to talk to you more about the scenario. But by the way, feel free to also engage us on Gitter, email, whatever. Yeah, and so yeah, I agree. Open Policy Agent can simplify a lot of stuff.
Yeah. There's a question that's been posted here in the chat window, maybe a Logic App question, but are there hooks into the workflow pipeline? Likewise, do we have hooks into the COM request pipeline? So Monty, when you say hooks, What are you referring to? Because logic apps effectively allows you to run these actions that allow you to do things. Are you referring to actions?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines, you know, like pre and post invoke kind of observability aspects. I don't know if Logic Apps already has that. You know, it's similar to the common request pipeline where you get pre and post to put some cross-cutting concerns, tuck under there, out of the way, that kind of thing.
I don't know, not familiar enough. You're just going to look at Logic Apps about what it can do.
Sounds good.
All right. So then there's a roadmap question. Any idea on event-driven actor activation? Oh, good question, actually. So yes. So one piece of work that we're planning on getting started on is having actors to be driven by topics, so pub sub events. So you can basically have an actor, it registers in the same way that you register an endpoint for a set of topics through a subscribe, and then when you publish and have that actor running, it lists, and when the actor activates, it will listen onto those events, and then it can receive those events from whatever subscribe topics it registered with. So that's actually a piece of work that we've just thought about getting started on, and in fact, and if Leon's on the call, he's got a proposal he's put into place, which I think he's going to publish and put into update inside the issue that's there. So yes, we're starting to actively work on that piece of work.
Yes, so just to recap, there's probably an issue for it, and keep an eye on the issue for the next few days because the design's probably going to show up there.
Yes, it's been a pretty common request coming from a lot of people for a while now, and I think it's going to be very useful to be able to have your actors as well as like endpoints that you have to be able to register for pub sub events. So yeah, hopefully we'll get that in. So just on timeline, the goal is to release a 0.8 milestone release next week. This particular piece of work won't make it on terms of the registering of actors, so that will probably be the release after that. But you'll see a release coming out next week with a set of capabilities inside it all that we kind of inside the milestone plan. Great. No question, but definitely excited to see more on the AZ functions integration. Yes, we'll dial in maybe in 2 weeks' time, hopefully. At least that's the goal.
Question from my end. With the 0.8 release, when the telemetry is then exposed over open sensors, is it correct that we get rid of this Dapr local forwarder then, and meaning pushing the telemetry directly to application insights?
Well, you still need a forwarder. So the question is, I mean, are we going to? So at the moment, we're still. Let me think. Actually, Young Boo, correct me if I'm right here. We're going to be switching to using the open telemetry collector as a way of doing that inside 0.8. Is that correct?
We're still working on it, but we are not sure we will switch from the local folder to the open telemetry
in this release.
Yeah.
Okay. So not yet.
So what we can see. So your question is how we can remove the local folder instead of using like.
That's the question. If we get rid of it, or if we will still need it in the 1.0 release or later.
I think in the later release, I think we still need some kind of like the collector for application side.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I see.
That's what we can say now. Yeah.
There'll always be a thing between. So we'll always write out into open sensors, open telemetry is the format on the wire, and then there'll always be a collector that runs on your machine that will push that from your machine up into App Insights.
Okay, I see. Good. And then again, the question, I'm still looking for a persistent state store, Azure managed persistent state store. What do you think, which one will be available next? Is it Cosmos DB or SQL?
In particular, you're looking at a transactional one that can be used with actors, yes?
Yeah, that one that can be used with with actors, and which I can actually query on, like a database kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the one that we're thinking that's becoming the most requested one is to have. So today, I think if your question was, maybe I jumped the gun here, was that you're looking for you need a transactional state store for actor representation, and right now that's either Redis or MongoDB as the choices inside there. And I think from a managed Azure perspective, one of the choices we're looking at is making sure Cosmos DB is that one. So Cosmos DB will probably be the one that we will choose to do that on.
Okay, but any ideas on when you will try to bring that in?
Well, it's like everything. It looks like you have a request. The request is being driven by a good scenario of yours. So I think that we'll start to look at that sooner on. So we'll start looking at that I'd like to think we'll start looking at that in the planning for the next release. So yes.
Thanks.
There's a question on the chat from Florian. Is there a way to extend the Dapr runtime across Kubernetes clusters? So do you mean for a service in one cluster to talk to a service in a different, separate Kubernetes cluster? Is that what you mean?
Exactly, this is what I mean.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. If you go to the Dapr repository and the wiki, you'll see that in the roadmap we have something that's called universal namespace. So no, currently today there is not, but that's a really interesting scenario, which you're talking about, and we have heard it from other people. And so there is this feature that we've been planning called universal namespace, which will allow you to create this single namespace where one application from one cluster will be able to transparently invoke apps from a different cluster as if they all lived in the same network namespace, which will be pretty awesome. That being said, if you have like a scenario that you need this for straight away, please reach out to us and we can prioritize this.
Yeah, so what you are trying to build is we have a centralized in-cloud cluster, and then we have like on edge or at the customer on site. Maybe it will IoT edge or it will be like just a cluster. So I was just thinking if there's I was trying to build sort of like a gateway, but it just didn't work out. So.
Yeah. Also, we have thought about integrating with something like HashiCorp Console so that you can create this flat network with service discovery. So basically anywhere that Console can run. Console, for example, can bridge between Kubernetes clusters and flat out VMs or between different technologies. And so that's also something that we might be looking at.
Okay.
For that. I mean, it's certainly a very interesting scenario.
Yeah, thanks for
no problem.
Thank
you.
Hey guys, I actually wanted to confirm part of my earlier question. I just wanted to, you guys may have touched on this in the past, but do we have hooks into the Dapr request pipeline? Pre and post invoke and things like that?
Well, there is a concept of middleware. It's inside Dapr where you can plug in middleware components that will run before and after the request is received at your endpoint. Does that answer your question? So for example, one of the example pieces that we put in there is middleware is OAuth. So you can do authentication on the request when it comes in before it arrives at your endpoint and where you run your code.
Yeah, that's basically it. So pre and post, you can jack in the middleware components.
Yes. Yeah, correct. That's right.
Do we have access to the headers?
Yes.
Well,
yes, you do.
You do. You have access to it.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I see Ricardo just gave a link there in the chat, so you can take a look at that.
Yeah, and Richard replies, is this sort of already supported by adding Dapr as a sidecars and ingress with like Nginx? But are there plans to have a more official tight gateway into Dapr world a la ingress? Yes, but I mean, we just are not too sure when. I mean, it's like the two common questions we hear, at least from an Azure perspective, is, will you integrate with other managed services like API management gateway and application gateway? That's one choice. I don't think there's going to be anything. We haven't got anything officially planned at the moment. No, is the answer to that. At this point in time, we've just shown that how you can just put Dapr as a sidecar to things like Nginx or traffic or HA proxy. But we're it's certainly something that we think about on the roadmap. for me, I think one thing that is interesting is application gateway and API management from an Azure perspective, and we can imagine there'll be other services like that that could also do the same thing, but not currently, no.
Yeah, and I bring that up, and I sort of already created an issue on the Dapr core repository because for our company, we use an excellent API gateway called Glue. Yes. And so having even the hooks to be able to, you'll call it the service discovery, but it's not technically service discovery, but having like an official Dapr API to enumerate services and being able to route to those. That way we could plug in other API gateways is definitely something that's on my mind.
I see, yes, yeah. The ability to enumerate the list of services is what you'd need.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be great if you could post a little bit more about what your scenario is with the Glue then and what you envision. That would be good to hear some of that stuff then.
Yeah, I think I may have conflated two issues, but there is an issue in the Dapr core repository called service registry, which is kind of touching on the 2 points to enable that.
Okay, I'll take a look at that issue and I'll continue the conversation there.
Good. I didn't see any more questions then? If not,
I would have another question. So on build, I guess the two Scots, they showed this project tie, which allows me to basically tie together several .NET or C# projects and also to tie together Dapr containers. Compared to the Docker Compose approach you showed earlier, in which direction do you think this local workload, local testing stuff will go? Should I focus more on the Docker Compose approach for running those local, or more on this project tie thing?
Well, the project tie thing was very experimental, so let's be very kind of upfront about that. And that was done to show how what is it having a local development experience would be more native to a .NET developer.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and it's as far as I'm aware at the moment, because a lot of that's done inside another team at the moment from the developer division team. They're building that stuff, and we're working pretty closely with them actually, so we understand what they're doing with the work. They should have working with Dapr. They wanted to put it out there as an idea to kind of spark ideas around some of these things, and to get feedback on that, and to kind of show that they're thinking about that local development experience. If you were to use something right now, you should use Docker Compose. I mean, this is why the work that Johnny did today is amazing, in my opinion, because we've had a lot of people ask, what does the deployment model look like in terms of an application model I can describe to place these things. And Docker Compose now is one of those ones that you can start to use in order to deploy those into a containerized environment anyway, at least.
Okay.
And we have other ones as well. I mean, we also have the open application model as a way that, as another way that we've been talking about describing applications and how those get composed and put together. And that's something that we're still closely working with and collaborating with other partners, particularly Alibaba and Crossplane around that thing. So you'll see some more effort and engagement inside the open application model as well. But for right now, if you're going to use it, I'd stick to Compose.
Okay.
I think that's it then. If there's any last one question we can take, otherwise we'll call it done. And thank you once again for joining us. This video will get posted up onto our YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks' time, it will be back to a Tuesday. We just had to move it to a Wednesday on this one occasion. So see you in 2 weeks' time on the Tuesday. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.